From a crushed truck in Siberia to a ruined cabin in Poland, from a missing hiker on the Appalachian Trail to a mother's yard where something stole pie without a trace, the signs are always the same. Something massive, silent, and intelligent lurking just out of sight. Watch until the end, because these 6 chilling stories reveal what may still be watching us. On August 22, 2025, a search team was sent to a remote logging road in Siberia after 4 hunters did not return as planned. Their vehicle was discovered overturned in the dirt, its roof bent inward, glass scattered everywhere, and doors torn completely from their hinges. The scene looked like a battlefield. Inside and around the wreck, the men were found lifeless, their bodies showing terrible force. Bones had been crushed, and deep, tearing marks ran across their skin, leaving no doubt that something with great power had struck them down. The silence of the forest made the sight even more grim, as if the woods themselves were holding on to the secret of what had happened. Not far from the wreck, a boy was discovered shaking in the brush. He was the son of one of the victims, and though young, he had witnessed enough to haunt him forever. He described seeing a towering figure covered in thick hair, pulling the men toward the cab of the truck before he escaped. His words painted the picture of a predator unlike any known creature, moving with speed and purpose. The boy's dog was also found at the site, hiding under the ruined vehicle, fur tangled with strange dark matter, too frightened to bark or come out. The ground around the road offered more clues. Enormous tracks, wider and longer than a human body could leave, pressed deep into the damp earth. Each print stretched several feet, perfectly shaped like a foot, yet far too big to belong to any man. They led away from the road, vanishing into the heavy forest without circling back. These steps carried with them the clear message that something far larger than any known animal had walked there. Closer inspection of the nearby trees revealed long scratches, gouged deep into the bark as if massive claws had raked across them. Branches had been broken and laid down in strange patterns, forming crude arrows that seemed to point toward the forest's depth. It was as if whatever had struck had left behind a path, a trail marked not by chance, but by choice. This deliberate arrangement disturbed investigators, raising the possibility that the event had not been an accident of wild rage, but something calculated, almost intelligent. Inside the wreck, the hunters' gear remained untouched. Rifles leaned where they had been stored. Backpacks sat neatly against the seat. Nothing had been stolen or scattered. This detail made the scene even more disturbing, for it suggested the attack had not been about food or survival. It was an act of force alone, leaving the men broken while their belongings stayed in order. Officials rushed to explain the disaster as the work of a dangerous animal, a predator out of place in the region's harsh landscape. But whispers spread quickly among locals. They had long spoken of a giant form that moved through the wilderness, silent yet watchful. The prints, the gouges in the wood, and the arrow-shaped branches only added to their fears. What happened on that August night was not seen as a simple tragedy, but as proof that something powerful and relentless still walks in the shadowed forests of Siberia. When investigators left the ruined logging road, the questions did not end. Word of the event spread quickly through the nearby villages, and with it came fear that reached far beyond the small clearing where the hunters had fallen. Families who had lived in those woods for generations began locking their doors earlier. Dogs that once roamed freely stayed close to porches, their bodies stiff at the edges of the forest. Hunters who had walked those trails since childhood suddenly chose other grounds, unwilling to risk the silence that now hung over the trees. The surviving boy carried the heaviest weight. He refused to sleep alone and woke often, shaken by dreams of heavy shapes leaning over him. He avoided windows, as if afraid of seeing glowing eyes watching back. The dog that had hidden under the vehicle grew restless, barking at shadows and refusing food for days. Both seemed bound together by the memory of that night, unable to return to the lives they had known before. Their bond became a living reminder of what had been taken from the family. Officials continued to speak of predators, insisting that a wild creature had lashed out in a rare act of violence. But the people who had seen the enormous impressions in the earth and the strange arrow shapes left among the branches knew better. They whispered of a thinking force, one that had planned its strike and left signs for anyone willing to see. For them, the deaths were not random. They were a warning, and warnings are not forgotten easily. The place where the truck was found became a scar in the land. No one traveled down that logging road again, not even the teams assigned to monitor the area. The crushed glass and bent metal were removed, but the deep ruts in the soil where the heavy vehicle had rolled remained for months, filled with rainwater that turned to stagnant pools. Around the site, the trees seemed to stand taller and lean inward, as if sealing off the clearing from curious eyes. The road itself grew over with weeds until only a faint path was visible. Families of the fallen men were left without answers. Their grief was compounded by the silence of officials who offered explanations but never truth. Funerals were held quietly, attended only by those closest to the victims. Stories spread in hushed tones afterward, tales of towering figures and dark shapes that walked among the trees. Some older locals said this was not the first time such signs had been seen, only the first time in years that the force had shown itself with such cruelty. The boy grew quiet, speaking little as the weeks passed. He carried scars no doctor could see. His nights were restless, filled with visions of branches arranged like arrows pointing into endless darkness. The image of his father being dragged away never left him. That memory shaped him, just as the marks left in the soil shaped the land. In the end, the road was abandoned, the site avoided, and the whispers never stopped. People knew something lived in the woods, something vast, intelligent, and merciless. The event became a story told around fires, not for entertainment, but as a warning. A reminder that the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets strike back with a power that cannot be fought. In December 2024, the calm slopes of the Alps turned grim when a ski patrol found a lone man stumbling back toward the resort after being missing for 3 full days in the frozen backcountry. His skin was pale, his lips trembled, and his whole body shook in violent bursts that looked far worse than a normal cold. His skis were still strapped on, but his poles were nowhere to be seen. His jacket and pants were soaked through, streaked with coarse, dark hair stuck against the fabric like it had been pressed there. The rescuers tried to ask what had happened, but his mouth never formed words. He only muttered broken sounds, eyes darting toward the white peaks, as if something still lingered there. The scene around him carried marks of its own. Pines near the trailhead showed raw scars where the outer bark had been torn away, high up where no human hand could reach. In the soft snow nearby, great shapes sank deep, each resembling the form of a bare foot, yet stretched far longer and wider than anything that should exist. The tracks did not stagger or twist as if lost. They moved with steady rhythm into the higher ridges, pressing down the snow with the weight of something massive. Locals who lived near the slopes spoke of strange growls echoing through the valleys that week. They were not the calls of wolves nor the groans of shifting ice. They rolled through the peaks in long, guttural tones that made cabins tremble and windows rattle. Skiers who had been on the mountain earlier said they felt watched, though no figure was seen. Some had chosen to cut their trips short, uneasy with the strange quiet that blanketed the ridges after sunset. The man who returned bore the worst scars of all. He flinched at every sound, refusing to close his eyes for more than seconds at a time. When someone mentioned the mountains, his body locked up in such terror that rescuers stopped asking questions. His stare was hollow, fixed on something only he could see. What had happened during those 3 nights remained trapped behind his silence, a silence louder than any story could be. Authorities filed their reports quickly, calling it nothing more than exposure and shock. They explained away the shredded bark as damage from storms and the tracks as warped drifts in melting snow. But those who stood there, who had seen the unnatural size and shape of the impressions, knew that no wind or thaw could leave such clear patterns. The coarse hair clinging to his clothes could not be traced to any known creature of the region. That December night became the beginning of whispers that still follow the resort. People talk of something that moved unseen among the ridges, leaving behind no sound but its growls, and no sign but the broken man who returned. Something had walked the snow beside him, and its shadow had not let him go even after he escaped. When the skier was brought back to the lodge, his return should have been a relief, but instead, it left a lasting unease that spread through the whole resort. His body had survived, but his mind seemed trapped in that frozen wilderness. He never gave a clear account of the nights in the peaks. Each time someone tried to press him, his hands shook until he nearly dropped whatever he was holding. Guests and workers who saw him described a man changed forever, unable to rest, always staring at the horizon, as if waiting for something to step out of the mist. Doctors at the resort said his trembling came from exhaustion and cold. They gave him warm blankets and food, but he ate little and spoke even less. His eyes would dart to the corners of the room, following movements that no one else could see. It was not the behavior of a man saved from danger, but of someone who knew danger was still close. His silence weighed heavier than any words could. Those who searched the slopes for answers found signs that only deepened the mystery. The stripped bark on the trees showed long grooves, smooth and deliberate, not the jagged work of weather. Snow still held massive impressions that had not yet melted, each pressed so deeply that rescuers had to climb down into them to measure their size. They were not scattered like random animal trails, but followed a path through the ridges in a steady line. The weight behind each step seemed enormous, as though the mountain itself had sagged beneath it. Villagers in nearby towns whispered of old tales revived by the sight of those tracks. They spoke of beings that roamed the high peaks, seen only during harsh winters, leaving behind nothing but fear and silence. The guttural cries that had been heard in the days before his reappearance were now tied to those legends, and people began avoiding the higher trails even in daylight. Some visitors canceled their trips altogether. The slopes that once drew crowds for their beauty now carried an edge of dread. The man who survived did not recover. Weeks later, he remained thin and restless, eyes ringed with dark shadows from sleepless nights. At every small noise he tensed. At every mention of snow or peaks, his breathing grew fast and shallow. Locals said he never truly returned from those 3 nights. That part of him remained lost in the wilderness with whatever had walked beside him. His presence became a living reminder of what could not be explained. Authorities released no further updates. Their reports spoke only of cold exposure and fatigue. But those who had stood on the mountain, who had seen the tracks and heard the low sounds echoing in the valleys, knew better. Something had followed the man. Something had left its mark not only in the snow, but in his very mind. The Alps had kept their secret, but they had given back a witness who carried their weight forever. In July 2025, 3 friends began a journey along a lonely part of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia. The day had been long but calm, and by late afternoon, they reached a narrow stream running through the woods. One of them stopped to fill a bottle, crouching near the edge of the water. The air was still until a sudden noise rose around him. Low growls rolled through the trees, heavy and deep, unlike anything the others had heard before. Before the two could react, sharp cracks echoed, branches snapping in quick succession as if something heavy moved in circles around the creek. The sound grew closer, pressing in from all sides. They called out, but the space where their companion had been was suddenly empty. His pack, shoes, and tools were gone as if swept away in a blink. Only silence answered their shouts. The ground near the bank should have shown signs of movement. The soil was damp from the stream, soft enough to hold even the lightest steps, yet there were no signs of him leaving. No bent grass, no disturbed mud. Nothing to explain where he had gone. The two searched frantically, but the forest seemed to swallow every trace. The air carried no echo, no response, only the faint rustle of branches far above. By the time darkness set in, they were forced to return to camp and call for help. Rescue crews arrived quickly, spreading out across the dense woods. Teams followed every path, but hours turned into days with no success. Dogs brought to track his scent wandered in circles, unable to follow a trail. Drones scanning the canopy revealed nothing unusual. It was as if the missing hiker had been lifted away without leaving a mark. Closer to the creek, investigators did find details that unsettled even the most seasoned searchers. Along the trunks nearby, long grooves cut deep into the bark ran higher than any man could reach. The marks looked deliberate, carved with force. On the forest floor, massive impressions dented the soil in wide strides. They were not boot prints, nor the tracks of any known animal. Each shape looked like a foot, but stretched far beyond normal size, spaced as if whatever had made them walked upright. Officials explained the disappearance as an accident. They suggested he may have slipped and been carried downstream, though no body, no clothing, and no belongings were ever recovered. For those who had seen the gouges and the enormous steps pressed into the earth, that answer felt thin. Whispers spread quickly among locals, speaking of a predator unlike any known creature. They said the woods held something vast and cunning, able to approach without sound, take what it wanted, and vanish again into the trees. The stretch of trail soon gained a new reputation. Hikers avoided it, even in daylight, crossing to other routes rather than risk the silence of that forest. The two who had been there that evening never returned to the path. They carried with them the memory of the sudden noise, the growls circling, and the instant when their friend was simply gone. When the searches ended without success, the weight of fear remained heavy on the trail. Days of looking turned into a week, and yet no trace of the missing backpacker was ever uncovered. The two companions who had been with him were questioned many times, but their accounts never changed. They described the deep sounds in the trees, the cracks of wood breaking, and the sudden moment when their friend was no longer there. What haunted them most was the silence that followed, as though the forest itself had swallowed everything whole. Authorities eventually called the case closed, writing it off as an accident in the wilderness. Their reports mentioned possible drowning or a fall into hidden terrain, but the lack of any remains or belongings did not match those claims. The gear that should have been scattered was never found. Even the smallest item, like a strap or a shoe, left no sign. Locals quietly dismissed the official explanation, certain that the forest was hiding something more deliberate. The aftermath spread quickly beyond the rescue teams. Nearby communities began warning travelers to avoid that section of the Appalachian Trail. Hikers who had once enjoyed the ridge began rerouting their trips, even adding hours to their hikes, rather than step into that uneasy stretch. Outfitters in town noticed a decline in rentals. Campsites close to the area sat empty. It was not just one disappearance. It was the weight of the stories that followed it. In the weeks after, others who ventured close reported strange details. Some said they found bark peeled from trees high above normal reach. Others saw dark shapes move between the trunks at dusk, vanishing before eyes could adjust. A few spoke of hearing the same kind of guttural tones that had been described during the disappearance. They came from different directions, circling, never drawing closer yet never fading away. None of these visitors stayed long. Most left before finishing their planned routes. The two survivors carried scars that did not fade. Night brought little rest, as the memory of the circling sounds returned each time they closed their eyes. One kept waking to the thought of footsteps outside, heavy and measured, pacing back and forth. The other refused to walk in wooded areas at all, even during the day. Their lives had been altered by a moment that had lasted only seconds, but its shadow stretched far longer. Months later, the gouges on the trees remained. Weather had worn them, but the depth of the marks kept them visible. The wide impressions in the soil had filled with rain and leaves, but the ground still showed signs of being pressed with unnatural weight. Hunters who knew the forest well avoided the spot. Even animals seemed to stay away, leaving it unusually still. The story spread beyond West Virginia, carried online and through word of mouth. It became part of a growing pattern, another tale of people vanishing under strange circumstances, with signs of something vast and unknown moving in the wild. For those who had seen the place, it was not a tale, but a memory that pressed into them like the prints in the soil. The trail remained open, but few dared to walk it, and those who did always moved quickly, never stopping near the stream where it had all begun. In November 2022, a quiet cabin deep in the woods of eastern Poland became the center of a terrifying event. A family had rented the place for a peaceful break away from towns and roads. The first nights passed without trouble, but one evening a strange noise came from the darkness. Low growls rolled outside the walls, deep and rough, unlike any animal they knew. The dog barked once, then went silent. When the family looked, the animal was gone. Only silence returned, heavy and tense. The front of the cabin soon shook as if something massive had struck it. Wood cracked and splinters flew as the main door gave way. The sound echoed through the rooms. Inside, the family found themselves trapped, their quiet trip turning into a nightmare. The furniture was no longer where it had been. Chairs were lifted and stacked into uneven towers, almost falling over. Knives and forks from the kitchen were set in a circle on the floor, laid out with strange care. Small belongings like shoes, toys, and bags had been placed in neat but unsettling patterns, as if arranged by hands that knew what they were doing. One child hid inside a closet, crouched low in the dark. Through a gap in the door, small eyes caught sight of a figure moving in the living room. It was large, covered in long hair, and so tall it bent near the ceiling. Its arms stretched down, almost reaching the ground. It moved with control, pausing as though studying the family before fading into the shadows again. The child stayed still, heart racing, afraid to even breathe. The adults faced the true horror. Something had struck them hard. Their cries filled the cabin but ended quickly. The force left marks that looked like claws, deep and wide, across their bodies. The crushing blows showed strength beyond any normal animal. By the time the night passed, the parents lay still, their lives ended by something unseen yet clearly powerful. Morning brought only dread. The child stepped out from hiding, shaking and broken, with no words strong enough to explain. The cabin stood ruined, the broken door hanging loose, and strange shapes still placed across the rooms. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been burned. Everything left behind seemed touched by a mind that wanted to send a message. Authorities came soon after. They studied the scene and quickly told the public it was a wild animal attack, most likely a bear. Their reports did not speak of the stacked chairs, the circle of utensils, or the quiet patterns left with care. But those who saw the place with their own eyes knew the truth did not match. The child lived, but the eyes never lost their wide, haunted look. Locals spread whispers of something vast, stronger than any beast, clever enough to arrange objects and step inside homes. The cabin was locked and left alone. To this day, it remains as it was that morning, its windows broken and rooms disturbed, as if the warning left inside has never ended. When the cabin was finally left behind, its story did not fade. The broken windows, the splintered frame, and the strange arrangements inside became a warning to anyone who passed. Locals whispered about what had happened, their voices low, as if speaking too loudly might call the presence back. Hunters refused to enter that stretch of forest, and even loggers stayed away, saying the air felt too heavy, the silence too deep. People began to avoid the backcountry altogether, leaving the land untouched, its stillness disturbed only by the sound of wind against the trees. The child who survived carried the scars that no doctor could mend. Nightmares came often, filled with towering shapes that moved through shadowed rooms. School days became difficult, with long silences and eyes always fixed on corners, as if waiting for something to step out. The loss of family weighed heavily, but the memory of what had been seen weighed even more. Over time, the child grew older, but fear never softened. Trust in quiet nights and closed doors never returned. Authorities returned in later months, hoping to explain what had happened in simpler terms. Their reports spoke of large animals driven by hunger, wild weather breaking the cabin door, and panic leading to tragedy. But no official could explain why furniture had been lifted into crooked towers, or why kitchen tools had been placed in such deliberate order. Those details were left out of the final records, hidden behind the claim of a bear attack. The silence of officials only deepened the sense that something larger had taken place. The cabin itself became a kind of marker. Travelers passing through the region said it looked frozen in time. The broken glass never cleared, the inside left in disarray. Some claimed that when they peered through the dusty windows, the same strange shapes of furniture and items still stood where they had been found, unchanged, untouched by human hands. For many, it felt as though the warning had been left on purpose, waiting for anyone bold enough to step inside. Stories spread beyond the villages, tales of towering shadows entering homes, arranging objects, and leaving behind bodies with crushing wounds reached far corners. Each telling carried the same uneasy message. This was not the work of an ordinary beast, but something stronger, smarter, and watching. Visitors from outside the region who once sought quiet cabins in the woods began to cancel plans, unwilling to take the risk. Years passed, but the forest never lost its strange stillness. Birds avoided nesting in the tall pines near the site. Animals moved around the clearing instead of through it. Even the air seemed colder, heavier, as if carrying the memory of that night. Travelers who dared to pass nearby claimed they felt eyes following them, though nothing ever showed. For locals, it was enough. They kept their distance, believing the land belonged to something unseen. The cabin stands abandoned, its walls fading but its warning intact. To those who know its story, it is not just a ruin in the woods. It is a reminder of what stepped out of the dark, a force that left no doubt of its power, and the silence it left behind has never been broken. In October 2024, a small group of hunters gathered deep inside the wild forests of northern Idaho, setting up their camp after a long day of tracking. The sun had just dipped behind the tree line when one of them spotted something strange at the edge of the clearing. Between the tall trunks, a large shadow moved upright, far taller than any man. The hunter, startled and afraid, raised his rifle and fired. The sound echoed through the valley, but the figure slipped back into the woods, leaving behind only silence and heavy unease. That night, the quiet did not last. Low growls began circling the camp, deep and guttural, as if coming from more than one direction at once. The noise was joined by sharp crashes in the underbrush, branches breaking as something massive moved closer and closer. The hunters sat frozen in their tents, hearing the heavy rhythm of steps pressing into the ground around them. Each sound seemed deliberate, like whatever was out there wanted them to know it was near. Suddenly, the camp was thrown into chaos. The tents began to shake as though struck by unseen hands. Fabric tore in long slashes, poles snapped, and gear was flung across the clearing. Cooking pots clattered as they hit the dirt, and backpacks were tossed aside like they weighed nothing at all. A food cache tied high on a branch came crashing down, ripped open, and spread across the ground in a mess of cans and wrappers. The hunters stayed hidden, too frightened to move, listening as their belongings were smashed and scattered. When the attack slowed, the noises outside grew stranger. Instead of random destruction, items were placed in strange piles, as if arranged on purpose. Shredded canvas was stacked neatly. Pieces of broken wood were leaned together into odd shapes. The hunters dared not leave their shelters, though each passing moment stretched into endless terror. By the time daylight crept through the trees, the place no longer looked like a campsite. It looked like a warning. Tents were shredded beyond repair. Every bit of gear had been tossed or crushed, and food was gone. The air felt heavy, the forest silent, as if all creatures had fled during the night. Yet not one hunter bore a scratch. The force that came had not touched them, but it had destroyed everything else around them with frightening strength and purpose. As the men slowly gathered what little remained, they saw the marks left behind. Huge impressions in the earth, shaped like feet but far too large, circled the clearing before disappearing into the dense woods. Each step pressed deep into the soft soil, wider and longer than any boot could make. The hunters stared at them in silence, knowing they had not faced an ordinary animal, but something far greater. When the hunters left the ruined campsite behind, the forest carried a weight that none of them could shake. They tried to convince themselves that it had only been an animal, but the destruction they had seen did not fit that answer. The strange piles of shredded canvas and broken wood looked intentional, as if a message had been left behind. Each step they took away from the clearing felt heavy, as though unseen eyes were still following. None of them spoke. Silence hung over the group the entire way back. When investigators arrived days later, the site was nearly untouched. The torn fabric still lay scattered, and the food cache was gone. Tools were bent out of shape, gear was useless, and the signs in the dirt were still visible. Enormous impressions led away from the clearing, but disappeared deep in the thick trees. The men who came to study the area did not stay long. Some refused to walk the perimeter. Others avoided stepping on the tracks, uneasy as if crossing them might bring back what had made them. Officials filed their report quickly, stating that wild bears were the likely cause. They explained the ripped tents as claw damage and the scattered food as foraging, but nothing explained the neat piles, the broken poles arranged in strange shapes, or the prints in the soil that matched no known animal. Locals who heard the story dismissed the official version immediately. They said this was not the first time hunters had returned shaken from those woods. Word spread quietly through nearby towns. Some said the forest was no longer safe. Campers began canceling trips, and seasoned hunters started avoiding that section entirely. Stories about growls, thuds, and long shadows passed from one person to another. At night, few dared to drive down the back roads leading toward the remote ridges. Even the boldest admitted the place felt wrong. The men who had lived through that night never returned to the wilderness again. Their silence spoke louder than any words. They left their gear behind and carried only the memory of the growls circling their tents and the heavy footsteps pressing into the soil. To them, the forest was no longer just trees and shadows. It was a place where something massive moved unseen, patient and intelligent, leaving behind not just ruins, but a warning. In September 2020, a mother living on a quiet property in the rural Midwest went outside to finish some light work in her garden. The sun was sinking low, shadows stretching across the grass. As she leaned over her plants, her eyes caught movement at the far edge of the yard. There, near the dark line of trees, a shape seemed to shift. At first, she thought it was just the play of fading light, but as she looked harder, her heart began to race. A massive, crouching figure appeared close to the porch, half hidden by shade. Its form was broad, dark, and heavier than any animal she had ever seen. Alarmed, she hurried across the yard toward the house. On the porch, The pie she had placed to cool was no longer whole. A neat piece had been removed, cleanly and carefully, as though someone or something had lifted it with purpose. Not a crumb littered the surface. No trail showed where it had gone. It was as though the slice had vanished into thin air. The family dog had slipped out earlier, but when it returned minutes later, its body trembled violently. Its fur was tangled with a dark, sticky residue that clung to its coat. The animal cowered low to the ground, refusing to step near the porch. The strange substance left behind carried no familiar smell. It was neither mud nor sap, but something unfamiliar that caused unease. That night, silence spread across the house, broken only by strange sounds echoing beyond the windows. Deep, guttural growls rolled through the property, circling with a steady rhythm. Heavy thuds pressed into the soil around the house, moving slowly, measured, and deliberate. The mother sat frozen, every noise tightening the air inside the home. It was clear the steps outside did not wander aimlessly. They moved in a pattern, circling again and again, as if whatever was out there was testing, waiting, and watching. The family remained still until dawn broke the darkness. When daylight spread across the yard, no signs of an intruder remained, only the missing piece of pie, the quivering dog, and the memory of growls that had kept them awake through the long hours of night. Authorities later arrived, brushing aside the details with simple explanations. They suggested it had been the work of local wildlife, a bear or raccoon drawn to food left outside. But the mother knew what she had seen near the trees. She knew the slice had not been taken by clumsy paws, and the sounds circling the house were not made by small creatures searching for scraps. Locals who heard the story believed her account. They whispered about something massive, something that could move silently, observe humans closely, and even take items without leaving behind a single sign of its passage. When morning light returned to the yard, the uneasy quiet remained heavy across the property. The pie dish still sat on the porch with a perfect gap where a slice had been removed, untouched by insects or animals through the entire night. The grass around the house carried deep marks, as though something weighty had pressed the soil in a slow circle. Each step looked too far apart for a person, too even for wildlife. The dog stayed close to the door, unwilling to leave the shelter of the house, its coat still tangled with that strange, dark residue. Neighbors who heard the story later avoided the property at dusk. They warned of things too quiet to be ordinary and too deliberate to be simple animals. Rumors grew about an unknown figure moving through rural land, entering close spaces and observing without haste. Some recalled missing livestock in the weeks before. Others whispered of shadows seen near barns and sheds. The pattern made many believe this was not a single chance event, but part of something larger that moved from place to place with purpose. Officials who reviewed the incident gave their reports quickly. They said the missing food and the dog's condition could be explained by wandering wildlife, yet they gave no answers for the neat removal of the slice or the heavy rhythm of steps that circled the house for hours. Their explanation left more doubt than comfort, and the family remained unsettled long after the visit. Over the following weeks, small details kept building unease. Tools left in the yard were found arranged in odd positions by morning. A bucket left near the porch was discovered upright on top of a barrel, too balanced to have fallen by chance. Nights were filled with uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional low sound drifting through the fields. Nothing entered the house, but the feeling of being watched never faded. The mother eventually stopped tending the garden after dark. Curtains were drawn before sunset, and the family dog refused to cross the yard without hesitation. The once peaceful property became a place of constant wariness. Locals continued to whisper about something intelligent moving in the dark, something that left no trail but carried a presence too strong to ignore. What happened that September night was not forgotten, and even as time passed, the story remained a quiet warning that the rural land held more than open fields. and simple woods.